Hello, this podcast is recorded on Gadigal country and we pay our respects to the First Nations custodians of the land, both here and also wherever you're listening from. Oh my God!
Hi.
I feel like I haven't seen you forever.
Yeah, well, I think we've both been running around a huge amount. And as I was coming here today, I just thought, I can't wait for this.
I know. There's so much stuff on the list that I have been dying to have a debrief about. None more so than
Garner?
Helen Garner. Ugh. Helen Garner's new book, The Season, which, of course, I read the second I could get my greasy little mitts on it. Have you read it yet?
I haven't. I've got it. In fact, I got my copy before you got your copy. I know for a fact. Ooh. But also, I knew that you were interviewing her, and I thought, anything new that she writes, I like to take very slowly, like, a kid saving up Easter eggs until September. So I thought, here's my strategy. I'm going to listen to you talk about it first, and then I'm going to read it very, very slowly, page by page over Christmas. But the thing that I do know about it from hearing her talk about it at our Melbourne show, which was amazing, is it's a totally different kind of book.
Yeah.
And she seems to have just found so much pleasure in writing it.
She has. So it's called The Season, and basically it just follows her grandson, Ambrose. Amby's high school or kind of 16-year-old AFL team through a season. And Helen, as she always does with her writing style, for her nonfiction, is just an observer. She's just kind of there in the background watching the training, listening to conversations, and then she constructs a kind of narrative about the season and these young men.
Look, were you surprised to find out how much of a football nut Helen Garner is? Because this isn't just anthropological. She has got a absolutely keen interest in watching footy.
Massive Western Bulldogs fan.
Massive emotional involvement, i.e. if the Dogs lose, she'll be down.
I wasn't surprised by that just because all my Melbourne friends are like that.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Or even the arty ones are like that. So, yeah, I wasn't surprised by that. So it has all of the hallmarks that you would love in a Garner book. Crisp, spare writing, gets to the point rapidly, super insightful.
Observation.
Brilliant observation after observation. Wonderful ear for an anecdote. It just packs you laugh, it makes you cry, ticks all of the usual Garner boxes. The thing that I really loved about it actually, and that was kind of surprising, was that it was a celebration of young men and how fantastic young men are, that they are, and the celebration, I guess, of their particular kind of masculinity, that masculinity that's on the cusp of going from boys to kind of full adults. And because what it made me think of was, wow, almost every conversation publicly that I hear about young men is about toxic masculinity and consent and all kind of negative connotations all the time about young men. But my experience of young men is that they're awesome. And what was lovely reading this was just reading about the way that they interact with each other and the things they say, and just that thing where they're still in some ways boyish but then also mannish at the same time. That's really beautiful, the observation that she brings there. And then she's described the book herself as a Nana's book about football. And that at the core of the book really is her relationship with Ambrose, who she's got a very special relationship with. Always has,
because even when he was a little teeny tiny tacker, he'd turn up in columns, because they live next door to each other, don't they?
Yeah, they've got a very close relationship. And it's kind of, I did this in conversation with her earlier this week in Melbourne at the Wheeler Centre, which the Wheeler Centre very kindly has said we can have the audio for to run as a bonus Chat 10 episode over summer, so keep an eye out for that. But she writes in the book that and this was quite close to the front of the book, she writes that it was kind of a way for her to spend more time with him as on the cusp of him being an adult and flying the nest. And I asked her, was she aware of that at the start when she started writing it? Did she know that's what she was doing, or only in hindsight did she realise, oh, that's what I was doing? And she said actually it was in hindsight. At the start it was just that she felt burnt out. I've got nothing to write about. What can I write about? Couldn't be asked to go and want to do research and dive deep into something, wanted to just do something observational. And yeah, her joy and the pleasure she took from it really comes through. So it's beautiful. I gave it to our friend Murph to read. She and I were catching a flight together, and I read the first chapter and we had ages to kill. And so I said to Murph, here, just read the first chapter. Anyway, Murph's like, gave it back to me. I just can't even read this. I've already cried 3 times. She cried reading the back page, the back blurb.
Well, one of the things I think often happens in Garner's nonfiction books is she starts thinking she's writing something and then it turns into something else. Like, I think half of the adventure of her nonfiction writing is you're on a sort of journey with her to see where this story leads. And there's something exhilarating about stories that lead somewhere different. And the exception with this one would be, I guess, that it sounds like it's been a pleasant journey rather than what often characterises her. It was why the reason she's burned out is she just puts everything into these nonfiction books that the last few have been on super difficult, draining, horrendous topics. And so she's got to like lie and pant for a while after finishing each one.
Yeah.
But she seems to be full of energy after this one, which is actually, I just really am so pleased that she's had that experience.
Funnily enough, because she's written a couple of books that have centred around court cases and sitting in court and watching things. And there were moments in this book where I felt like, wow, watching training is a little bit like being in court sometimes, which is sometimes there's a lot of action and things are really interesting, and there's often hours that are really, really boring and quite dull. And often people are talking about stuff that you can't really understand what they're talking about.
But also, I mean, if you're someone like Helen, you're always watching, and you're watching tiny, tiny little interactions between people and how groups work and how individuals relate to each other.
Yeah.
That's interesting what you say about the portrayal of young men, though, because I think that is definitely an area that gets missed out because a lot of the, quite rightly, public discourse is about, you know, young men and young women and how they interact and what social media or porn or whatever is doing to those interactions. And they are urgent discussions to have, but it means also that material that is only about young men, not about their relationship to women, but their experience becoming themselves, is sort of a bit, can be left out if it's not newsworthy. Like, there's no yarn if it's just boys kind of having a good time and not hurting anybody. You know what I mean? And I think it's unbelievably counterproductive, because if it conveys to boys and young men that they're sort of expected any minute to do something dreadful,
I think that is the message that they get a lot of the time. And so that's why it was so lovely to read something that was just actually saying, hey, young guys, you're awesome, and you're awesome, you know, as you are. It was lovely.
But I think, I mean, I'm really enjoying reading Helen's reflections as she gets older, and her reflections on what it is to be young, also what it is not to know your own potential or power, which is what she was writing about in The First Stone, which is obviously super controversial. She's like, these young women don't know their power. But I really love her reflections across the life course. She wrote this beautiful, beautiful column for The Guardian a year or two back on the occasion of turning 80. And she talked about happiness. I won't quote it correctly, obviously, but she said, you know, I used to think that happiness was something that you arrived at, you know, this state, this sort of heavenly city that would sort of open its gates to you. And what I've learned over my life is that sometimes happiness is something you're not aware of until it's gone. And she said, I'm at this age now, I don't hope for this exalted state of happiness anymore. I'm going to settle for random stabs of extreme interestingness.
Yeah, totally.
And then, anyway, have a look. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing.
But she, I would suggest, is a woman at the peak of her powers.
God, unbelievable. Yeah. Anyway, I am going to, I don't have a lot of time off over summer, thank you, electoral cycle, but I am looking forward to just leafing slowly through and enjoying that. I have a fantastic book that I'm reading right now, this is what I've been waiting to download to you about. It's Naomi Klein's book, Doppelganger.
Oh, yeah. Now, my friend Amanda's lent me this. I have been waiting and waiting to hear this. You talk about this.
Right. So Naomi Klein, you know, as you recall, became very famous when she wrote the book No Logo, about branding and corporate branding and capitalism.
Who
and
Naomi Klein is.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
That's right. And your slight confusion about who is Naomi Klein is
Naomi Wolf.
Sadly a global phenomenon because I don't know who wrote their book first, but they're both about the same time. Another Naomi, who, as Naomi Klein says in her book, is also a brown-haired Naomi who is Jewish and has written a bestseller. Naomi Wolf wrote The Beauty Myth.
Yeah.
Totally different topics, but they both wrote zeitgeisty books at around about the same time, right? Had enormous success. Around about the time of COVID or just pre-COVID, Naomi Wolf wrote a book that was sort of, she had a clanger of a radio interview where one of the foundation points, theoretical points of her book was sort of debunked live in a radio interview. I think the book was pulped or withdrawn or whatever, and she just, it was a debacle. And then, since then, Naomi Wolf has kind of become a bit of a conspiracy theorist. She was a definite anti-vaxxer during COVID. A lot of posts about, don't stand next to somebody who's been vaccinated because of viral shedding and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, what Naomi Klein discovered is that most of the world doesn't know which Naomi is which.
Yeah.
And so this book is about Naomi Klein's experience of being mistaken for Naomi Wolf.
That's extraordinary that it's a whole book. So how is it a whole book?
Okay, because that's what I thought. Okay, well, that's interesting, but also how are you going to sustain that? And what the book actually winds up being about is doppelgangers, the way that the dark and secret parts of our identity sometimes conflict with our public parts.
Oh, yeah.
There's a bit of the history of doppelgangers in literature. Here's an extra twist. My doppelganger is a person who has undergone such a dramatic political and personal transformation that many have commented that she seems like a doppelganger of her former self, which in a way makes me a double of a double, an uncanny state of affairs even Freud did not anticipate. And look, it's really funny because she starts off the book saying, listen, I have just gone down a full Naomi Wolf wormhole. I have listened to so many Joe Rogan podcasts. I am an academic. Why am I going here? Is it a waste of my time? I'm ashamed of myself. She writes, there were plenty of other important things that I neglected during this time of feverish subterfuge, i.e. investigating Naomi Wolf. That summer, I allowed my 9-year-old to spend so many hours watching a gory nature series called Animal Fight Club that he began to ram me at my desk like a great white shark. I did not spend nearly enough time with my octogenarian parents who live a mere half hour's drive away. Anyway, so it starts off with her self-disgust that she is so occupied with finding out what happened to Naomi Wolf,
Right.
for whose crimes she is regularly held
that would
accountable,
be
right?
so annoying.
It's out of her control. But then, and she's like doppelgangers in literature, it's all interesting. And then she gets into why is this bothering me so much? Because I'm the no logo label. I oppose, corporate branding. I think it's horse shit. I've made a huge effort in my life to not become a brand. And now I'm feeling insecure because this woman is kind of spoiling my brand, right?
Oh, that's great.
Right?
Yeah.
And so in a way she returns to her original subject, but she's also probing her own indignant response to having her own brand interfered with, even though that is consistent with her stated values, right?
Oh, that's so good.
Oh, it's so good.
Okay, that sounds
and
great.
it's really very, very readable and fun. But she's also, she just goes into just conspiracy theory, its attractions, in this
great.
sort of tribalized age. So it's bang on. It's really, it feels relevant to my current state of mind, which is just full overwhelm at the end of 2024, right? I try to read the news and there's so much information just sort of slamming into my face that I feel confused and overwhelmed and as though I wish everything would just sort of quieten down a bit so I can straighten out what I think about all these things. Even, the last week of Parliament, 70 bits of legislation like smashing through. It's just like, sorry, what? Like, God, slow things down.
How you've described that, God, I love the way writers think though, like that they'll turn something around and look at it from so many different ways. That's so cool.
Will also allow a book to become a book even when you don't know what it's going to be. And I think, we were just talking about that 1 second ago with Garner, and this is obviously something that's been bothering her. And she describes the progression of her responses on social media to people who, and sometimes she would like open up her Twitter or whatever she's on, and there'd be this pile of just massive spite and abuse, or intense support, and she'd think Naomi Wolf has done something. I don't know what, but she's done something.
Oh my
God!
And
like she's being asked for comment. Like they, and because I guess both Klein and Wolf. When did they write their books? I can't remember anything.
I actually feel like the
see my
Beauty Myth
earlier
was
remarks.
written a long time before No Logo, but
no, about the same time, I think. So it's just. It's kind of it starts off tangential to this sort of common state of discourse internationally, but it ends up really engaging with it. These things where you go off half-cocked, you sort of think, oh, who is that? I think I know who that is. That's such a common experience. And, I don't know. Both of us probably do social media less than we used to just because it's so overwhelming. But, I know sometimes if columns that I write get popped out on social media, usually 70% of the response that you get, particularly if it's negative, is from people who haven't read the article. They've either read the headline or whatever. And I think poor old Naomi Klein, they haven't even read to the end of the name.
So The Beauty Myth was written in 1990 and No Logo was written in 1999.
Oh,
yeah.
I hate it when you're right. Well, it's the 90s, mate. We're elderly.
90s. It's only a decade.
Okay.
They were written in the same decade. So you can see why you would get those two people confused.
Yeah.
So now, speaking of the question of brand reminds me of another person who about whom I've just watched a documentary, Martha Stewart.
Oh, right.
Have you watched this?
No, but I'm sort of desperate to, because I've heard people having reactions to it.
Wow. Okay,
I've always found her absolutely fascinating.
Okay, so it's called Martha. It's a documentary on Netflix. It's not a series. It's just a one-off thing. So when I was the Washington correspondent for the ABC in the early 2000s, Martha Stewart's trial was a gigantic story for insider trading. But I had never heard of Martha Stewart before I went to live in the United States. And in fact, I can't recall filing on that story for Australia. Maybe I did, but she wasn't a well-known person in Australia.
I remember being aware of it, but all I knew was that she was some sort of homewares and cooking guru.
She was kind of like, I guess she started as kind of like, well, actually, there isn't really of her era a comparable Australian. She's a bit like Margaret Fulton, but she was much bigger because she was ahead of her time. She created a whole brand of homewares. So she started off as a kind of
like Maggie Beer plus homewares.
Yeah, she started off
Maggie
as like a
cooking
tips, cooking show kind of person. She was a caterer actually originally. Ended up with her own television show, and then created this whole gigantically profitable empire called Martha Stewart Living, which was in like kind of the Kmart equivalents, Walmart, and so on.
Maybe Donna Hay would be the kind of equivalent.
Let's
stop trying to find an equivalent.
She was pretty revolutionary and ahead of her time. And she was all about beauty and perfection. And, even though you're a home cook and you don't have a lot of money, you can still make your table look beautiful. So she had this big mass market appeal. And then in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, she got pinged for insider trading, which she always denied.
How do you do insider? I know this is like, what is money laundering for you? But
it was a friend who gave her a tip that this particular stock that she should sell because something was going to happen. She sold it, but they disputed that the conversation actually occurred and so on, blah, blah, blah.
Don't you ever get the feeling that insider trading is one of those crimes that's committed every single day?
Oh, it totally would be.
Right?
But it's out of our pay grade because we
don't have any investments.
Yeah, we don't have
stupid.
any money to invest.
But just the idea that somebody at some fancy lunch or something is not going to go, hey, surely that happens every second.
It must happen all the time.
It reminds me of that great podcast. What was that one by the guy from the Financial Review who did the podcast about the two young men that
that was incredible. The Shore Thing.
The Shore Thing. Oh, God, thank you. Because I was about to be embarrassed.
If you're looking for some summer listening, have a listen to that. The guy
School
traders
friends.
and uni friends who the guy works for the Australian Bureau of Statistics and he's leaking the unemployment data to his friend who's
Just
short
20
on the
minutes
Australian
early.
dollar.
I mean, who's just like
And then they get busted.
betting against the Australian dollar. It's
The
just
guy who worked for the Bureau of Stats has gone on the record and told the story. It's absolutely riveting. Anyway, so Martha gets pinged for insider trading and she goes to prison. It was a very big story at the time. She actually goes to prison.
how did she style her cell? That's what I want to know. Like, was it sort of like, look, the average prison cell can look forbidding, but a throw rug and a couple of tasteful cushions. Think candle lighting. Just soften that lighting. Sorry.
So she, the documentary is built around a set piece interview with her. Funnily enough, she reminded me a little bit of Michael Jordan in The Last Dance because she's very, very difficult to get a handle on. She does not like and kind of almost prides herself on not showing any emotion. And so she'll talk about extremely emotional, difficult things in a very cold way, almost a mocking way. When she's asked, like, how did you feel about something? She'll kind of like roll her eyes about, how did I feel about it? Ugh. And then
Why
she'll
is she
say,
doing this interview?
I guess she thought it was a good idea to do the doco. But then she'll talk about something like, say, losing the case and being told, like, you're going to be going to prison for a year. Well, I was in despair. And she'll just say it in the coldest, most clinical kind of way. Like, she's really unusual. And the other thing that struck me, she's clearly a very, very talented person with huge capacity for hard work. I was gobsmacked by how many things she knew how to do, like building stuff and garden things and cooking things and
Stenciling
design
wallpaper.
things. Like
Yeah.
an unbelievably competent human being. And she definitely would have got some blowback because she was kind of a woman who knew what she wanted to do and so forth, but also a kind of difficult personality.
So who else is interviewed for the, like, did you get,
Only her.
sometimes I think
yeah.
when these people who haven't spoken give away an interview, there are all these terms, like, is it her production company that made the film?
I didn't check that, but I suspect it probably would have been.
I always think with that Michael Jordan one, like that footage belonged to them. Like, I'm always sort of like, where is this coming from? And
it was pretty, I mean, she gave a full act. She gave a big interview and there was a lot of footage of her. Like, she clearly was very cooperative. So
Yeah.
I don't know if it was, I assume
but the
it was
other
her
people
production company,
interviewed,
but
were they kind of like, Martha, she's amazing? Or were they
pretty
kind
much,
of,
yeah. Pretty much, yeah. So, and they had a lot of archive and all that kind of stuff. So they've built, it's just a thing about her life story. I'd never seen any of the early archive of her. She was quite amazing when she was young, really beautiful and just, you know, super telegenic and great talent and so on. But
Is she back in business now? Like, I mean,
yeah, she is actually, because she got this venture going with Snoop Dogg where they just
God,
did
that's
this.
right.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I love those videos.
Yeah, they're
See, that's
fantastic.
like pre
They've
or
got great-
during lockdown, so I can't.
Great
I'm like,
chemistry, works
Yeah.
a treat. And so she's kind of, she went to prison and then she's done this comeback. She talks about going to prison in the doco. But a bit like Michael Jordan in his doco, you feel a bit, like, for example, she was an utter perfectionist on everything, but she doesn't seem to take, like, I like paying attention to things in great detail, but I take a lot of pleasure out of that. So say if I'm in a tart baking phase.
Oh, mate,
at
I've
the
been a
moment.
witness to it. Having to sit there listening to you talking about what a marsh is. Or no, what did you get obsessed with in the UK? What is a moor?
Oh, a moor,
What's a
yeah.
moor? Let's go look at some moors and research moors. And mate,
But when I'm trying to do
dying,
something right,
actually
like
dying.
do a sponge cake right or make a tart right or whatever, or do my cello practice right, I take a lot of pleasure out of the activity. I find it really pleasurable. I love it if I pull a tart out and the top of it's like just smooth like glass. Like, love it.
Can I just say, the other day I got a text from sales who said, as you know, I'm on a tart bender at the moment. I'm like, check. That checks out. I've got 3 dozen egg whites. What can I do with them? Do they freeze? I'm like, do they freeze, doll? They're better when they're frozen.
Yeah, I never knew that.
Yeah. So I'm like, okay, here's what you're gonna want to do, like a TikTok video. You're gonna want to measure out your egg whites into 220 ml sections, put them in a snap lock bag, and then whenever you need to make a pavlova, you're gonna pull out one of those bags, defrost, add a cup and a half of castor sugar, and you've got like pavlovas on tap in there.
Yeah.
But they are actually better frozen, I reckon.
No, that's
egg
really-
whites in for pav. I don't know why it is.
I'll be curious to test that out. But these recipes, which are from a book that I'll talk about at some point called Tarts and On, which I'm just methodically cooking through after going to the Tarts and On store in Melbourne, and they were just so delicious.
Are you taking like statins now to like keep your cholesterol? I mean, like whatever
Yeah,
you take
totally.
for cholesterol.
Totally.
Also, I just haven't had one tart delivery from you.
Well, that's just because I haven't seen you. But I did take one. I went away with our friends Gwen and Murph and everyone last weekend, and I did take one. And I swear to God,
great.
and I
I'm
don't
sure
say
that was
this-
nice.
I don't say this lightly. I think it might have been the most delicious dessert I've ever made. It was chocolate custard over a layer of salted caramel in a nice crispy tart shell. It was good.
Just without wanting to digress, but like we're in the Martha Stewart area, so it seems
Yeah.
appropriate. What is your current pastry?
Oh, that's the thing I'm
Shtick.
struggling with, and I'm thinking I might shift to a different pastry recipe that I like because I'm not having a lot of success with their method. And like pastries,
We're talking short crust here.
short crust, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
You're getting to kind of like
interestingly,
you're not crumbly enough or too
yeah,
crumbly.
I think not crisp enough. Interestingly, they do a blind bake, of course, but then I'm used to ones where I pull out then the weights and then give it another bit of a blasting. They don't do that.
Oh,
So I'm wondering if I should go back to my tried and tested short crust pastry.
what
Anyway.
fluid are you using to bring it together at the last minute? You know how you just-
Water, iced
Okay.
water.
Can I give you a tip?
Yeah.
Vodka?
Vodka.
Yeah,
Wow.
because
In the water or
so water, no water,
No
just
water.
chilled vodka.
Wow.
Because you only need like a tablespoon or so of fluid
yeah,
generally.
not a huge amount. Yeah.
So water, so you can get a tough pastry if you're going to use water, it's got to be super cold, right?
Yeah.
But it does sort of activate the gluten a little bit.
Yeah.
Whereas vodka, it's a liquid, but it doesn't do
How
anything with the gluten. So
that's interesting.
you'll get
'Cause
a
this-
shorter pastry.
This recipe, there's a lot of fridge resting to allow the glutens to then deactivate themselves or whatever they do. I don't
Just
know the
don't give them
science
the
of it.
chance to get started.
Okay, good to know. I'll try that.
Works with sweet or savoury. And of course, nothing tastes like vodka or there's no booze left in it by the time
Yeah,
it's all
that's
cooked.
right. By the time it's all cooked and stuff. Yeah, but the recipes are so beautiful. But I've become
The other
so
thing-
obsessed. I've got like 3 different kinds of pectin and some citric acid.
Oh,
and various
okay,
things
you're
like
deep
that.
then.
I'm
Okay.
real deep.
The other like pastry handling technique that I will give you for free, although I think I got it from Moro, maybe I can't remember exactly where, but when you've chilled your short crust pastry and you've got that exciting phase where you've got to take this cold pastry and roll it out thin enough to and it's like cracking and okay. Here's a trick.
Between 2 sheets of baking paper.
Oh, well beyond that, mate. Yes,
Oh.
of course, yes, a sheet of baking paper, but instead of just putting your glob of pastry on there and then other paper on top and then cracking, blah, 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 take a coarse grater and you grate that cold pastry into a circle
Oh.
and then you so it's already distributed in its chilled state. Then you put the other pastry, baking paper over the top, roll it.
And
You've got
it's just,
a cold, not cracked, ideally
wow.
shaped. Yeah.
Okay, I'll give that.
It's actually life-changing.
I'll give that a shot. The their rolling method is keep rolling in a circle, like keep spinning, so that you're not doing like an oval and then trying to extend the oval the other way, right? Because you're trying to, rather than stretch the glutens, you're trying to move them.
Yeah.
So okay, so
Other thing you can do is grate them.
grating. Okay, good thought. So
Back to Martha.
all this stuff gives me a great deal of pleasure. Like I love sort of all the little tiny details you do to make something look beautiful or perfect. She's a perfectionist, but she seems to derive no pleasure from it. It seems like an obligation or a tyranny almost that everything has to look beautiful. She doesn't seem to then sort of step back ever at the end and just go, oh, that makes me so happy to look at how that table looks or whatever. So yeah, she was really difficult, a bit like I say like Jordan, because obviously both highly accomplished people with tricky personalities. That was hard to get a handle on. I just didn't know what to make of her by the end of it.
Gosh, that's so interesting. But it's consistent with this sort of pattern of relentless expansion, right? Where, she's great at this, so then she expands into that, is great at that, and then like, let's try this, She sounds a bit like a shark,
Her you know how
Having to
sometimes with
keep
people
moving.
when their external vibe is very judgy and harsh and kind of difficult. Often when I meet people like that, I think, oh man, I feel sorry for you, because if that's what your external monologue's like, imagine how harsh it must be internally. Like imagine how harsh you must be on yourself internally. And so I had a bit of a feeling of that with her as well.
Was there a self-pity, do you think, or?
No.
Right.
No, she was tricky. You know, when Jordan, there is one bit in The Last Dance where Michael Jordan tears up, and it's when they play him some interview clips from his teammates, and they're all going, didn't really like him that much. He wasn't really a good guy. He wasn't fun to hang out with. And he kind of gets really emotional because he realizes the cost of his driving of everybody, and he thought he was doing the right thing, was that they just didn't really like him very much. There's not a single moment in it that I really feel like you get to that with her. Like for example, her best friend testifies against her in the insider trading thing. The best friend who's been on holidays with her says, oh, I'm sure I heard her have a chat with so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, it's the most gigantic betrayal. It's a woman who she's been friends with for, I think she was a bridesmaid at a wedding or something, years and years and years. And even when that comes up, she's kind of just scornful of it. She doesn't really show kind of emotion. Her emotional range seems to just run from scorn to irritation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But I guess that she also, one assumes, doesn't really care if people like her or not, which is an amazing commercial advantage for women, I reckon, because often held to a slightly different standard in terms of...
And what a survivor to have done. I mean, as you'll see in the doco, and not just the prison thing, but like her entire life, an absolute powerhouse of a human being.
Did they interview Snoop Dogg?
He's in it, but I don't think he's interviewed. I think I'm trying to remember what the difference is between the archival clips of other things they've done and whether he's interviewed. I can't remember. I don't think so. Oh my God, we've got so much to talk about.
I know,
like so much time
crack on. Okay, I saw an incredible piece of theatre a couple of nights ago, and look, by the time this is on air, I think it will have finished, but I'm going to pop into the group and encourage everybody to go see it. It's at Belvoir, a show called August Osage County, which
very
is
famous play.
Yeah, but I mean, it's been produced in Australia a couple of times. I actually saw it 13 years ago when it came to Sydney with the American company Steppenwolf, which the writer was part of. The writer is Tracy Letts, who wrote it I think around like the 2000s, like the first decade of 2000s. And he won a Pulitzer for it. It's an unbelievable piece of writing, incredibly disciplined, funny, like ridiculously funny, but then turns on a dime to just tragedy. So the story is there's a elderly couple, Beverly, the husband, played by John Howard, and Violet, the wife, played by Pamela RAAAABE. Anyway,
see podcast episode 8 million episodes ago where you would get the in-joke about
RAAAABE. I mean, I think the greatest living actor in Australia.
She's amazing.
I think. And they are just this incredibly twisted up, messed up couple. He says, so the opening scene is John Howard playing Beverly. He's hiring a young woman to move in and be their sort of housekeeper because his wife, Violet, has got mouth cancer and she has to be driven to her chemo appointments. RAAAABE. Yeah. And Beverly explains to this young woman who is a Native American young woman, her father's died, she's struggling to find work. She's like, I need the work. And he says, I won't try the accent because it's set in the US. Well, I drink and my wife takes pills. That's the agreement we've arrived at over the years. So she's hopped up on everything from oxycodone to, uppers, downers, the whole lot. And he says, she's so high on pills, she gets a little unstable. And his speech to this young woman is this incredible soliloquy, basically. And towards the end of it, you hear this sort of fleshy thud backstage, and it's RAAAABE falling over. And then she kind of appears through a window, and she can barely stand up. And she's messily lights this cigarette. And I've seen RAAAABE in a bunch of things, but she is unbelievable in this
Wow.
character. She is a true monster. They have 3 children, 3 daughters, all of whom have moved away except one who's sort of stuck around a little bit. And they've all married, had disastrous marriages or marriages that are disastrous that they haven't actually announced are disastrous yet. And then there's her sister, played by Helen Thompson, who is sort of on her way to kind of attend, and because there's a looming disaster, sorry, I'm skipping through, the main event that happens is that the husband disappears.
Oh, John Howard disappears.
John Howard disappears. But weirdly enough, like it's beautiful direction, he actually stays on stage. He's just like sitting at the piano.
Oh.
So even though he's gone and all these daughters converge on the house with their catastrophic husbands and children, and the sister of Raabe turns up with all her issues and her husband. So it quickly becomes a sort of like nightmare family Christmas. And Beverly is gone and nobody knows where he is. But he's still sitting there at the piano. So it's kind of this great piece of direction. I think conventionally this play is produced with a 3-level set. So it's sort of like the house. But of course at Belvoir, there's not enough room to do that.
Right.
So they've kind of, there's sometimes characters on stage that aren't actually there. It's really, it sounds kind of strange, but it actually perfectly works. And Beverly, when he's on stage, isn't interacting with anybody, he's not doing anything. So it's not like he's just there as this sort of pulsing presence
yeah.
until the point at which they find his body, and then he just walks off stage.
Wow. That sounds very
And
clever.
like, here's the thing, like it's 3.5 hours long, there's 2 intervals. So you might look at it and go, far out, that's a beefy night at the theatre. But at the end, I could happily have watched the whole thing again.
Oh my God, how amazing.
So it's like...
Well, you banged on about it so much that I got a ticket, but sadly by the time this podcast goes to air, it's going to be
Anyway, but it's going to
over.
Perth because it's like a co-production with the State Theatre over there. So that is amazing news. I'll say that Bert Labonte is also in it. Like who we met at the Adelaide Cabaret Festival. It's got Tamsin Carroll. It is an incredible piece of theatre.
Before we wrap,
anyway.
I'll do 2.
God, is it rap time already?
It certainly is.
Shoot.
I'll do 2 quick things.
Yep.
One is I'm about halfway through Virginia Trioli's book called A Bit on the Side.
Oh, yeah,
You'll
great.
really enjoy that. It's half memoir. It's kind of, I guess what you'd call it is a food memoir. It's not a proper memoir, it's a food memoir. But I think for anyone who enjoys food and cooking and eating, it just is so luxurious because I love hearing about great meals people have had and memories that they associate with certain meals. I think, I lived for a year in Melbourne. Our family moved down there when we were young. Virginia grew up in Melbourne and lived not that far away. And so much of what she talks about is in her Melbourne childhood. I felt like, oh yeah, I really remember and relate to that era of being a teenager at that time and so on. Anyway, you'll really enjoy it.
And I think people know Trioli as a broadcaster, but she's a beautiful writer, just a beautiful,
she's an
beautiful
excellent writer.
And she
really
brings all of that sort of artistic sensibility as well as, she
Yeah.
does news, she does everything. Do sign up for her weekend newsletter, by the way, which the ABC puts out. There's always something great in there.
Her writing reminds me of a bit of my friend Caroline Overington and also Mia Friedman, in that they have this great writing style that just hooks you in and just carries you along. It's like they're just talking to you. It's really wonderful writing. The other thing was this strange little doco that I watched that you can just find on YouTube if you Google it. It's called 3 Salons at the Seaside. It was a BBC doco.
You mentioned this in conversation to me and I was like, what?
Yeah.
I didn't get what it was.
It was a kind of observational, kind of like what Helen Garner does, but on camera. And it was some hair salons in a seaside town in the UK. And it just follows the ladies who work in the salons and the ladies who go there. What it ends up being, it was filmed in the early 90s, but it feels kind of like the 50s or 60s actually. But you realise that's because of the age of the women. But what it actually turns into is a meditation on women being left alone later in their life and how they fill their time. Because a lot of them are widows or people who are caring for ill husbands. And so the salon and the visit to get their set and whatnot is their weekly.
So hang on, so it's shot.
touching.
It's shot just in the salons. So it's like the
Just an
hairdressers
observational doco.
interacting with their clients, right?
Yeah.
Because one thing I think is really interesting about hair salons is for women who are super busy, it's kind of the only couple of hours where they're compelled to sit there and they can't do anything else. So it's kind of like this enforced leisure in a way. Like all of the research shows you that when women's lives get really pinched, the first thing they drop is exercise or, stuff that they're doing for themselves. But if they retain a hair appointment, that's kind of...
Except I bet you're like me, which is I actually work at the hairdresser.
Yeah,
My hairdresser
sadly,
is always
Wi-Fi is, it's true, yeah. But, okay,
anyway,
that sounds cool.
It's only 55 minutes and it's the most beautiful little time capsule of this particular place. It's oddly moving. It's really lovely,
okay.
lovely
That sounds
piece of work.
fantastic.
And the woman who directed it ended up becoming a quite famous director, and people often say, oh, you can tell because that was the most beautiful little piece of work. Yeah, it's lovely.
Oh, amazing the stuff you've shown up. I'll finish since we're talking about, we're talking about chick writers and legends during this podcast. I noticed the pattern. I'm reading Steph Tisdell's book. It's like a YA novel called The Skin I'm In. Steph is a terrific Australian comedian and it turns out can really write like beautifully and it's funny. So it's about a young woman called Layla who's in her final year of school and she's kind of just trying to be a normal teenager, and her cousin comes to stay, Marley, who's a bit of a troubled, he's come to take a little bit of a break from his home in another territory where he's been getting in trouble. Anyway, it's kind of like it's one of those kind of YAs. It's probably about mid-teens. I don't think there's a few kind of sort of more grown-up concepts in there. But it's funny, it's light, and it's dark, and it shades between the two very beautifully, as great comedians can do.
What's to not love?
What's to not love, or what's not to love? Is that a bad word order? I don't know. Okay, I just don't want to end this podcast with a dangling preposition, my friend.
That's going to haunt people.
That would hurt
for the rest of the day.
God, sweet dreams. Okay. Thank you for enjoying both the oral and the visual experience of me talking to this lady here. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for so much more content. It'll probably quell your enthusiasm, but give us a go or listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
Did you ever think that we'd be telling people to subscribe to our content?
No, I did not.
We're cool at last.
Don't. You're making me look bad in front of my children. Again.